I'm often confronted with the perception that the Eastern Bloc was something uniform, just the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence operating in lockstep on orders from the Kremlin. And given that the Soviets were not exactly fans of political pluralism, it's easy to assume that their puppet regimes would all be the same, right? Well, no, that's wrong. Examples like East Germany with its own cultural thaw of sorts, Hungary with its goulash communism focused on increasing living standards, and Romania, which had none of that. Nicolae Ceaușescu's totalitarian practices more closely resembled those of North Korea, a bizarre personality cult, questionable urban planning, food rationing, they had it all. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at Romania, its turn to totalitarianism, austerity, and eventually a revolution which was anything but velvet. This is the Cold War. Okay, so we talked about Romania in the post-war period in a recent episode. Naturally, you've already seen that video, but just in case you may have forgotten, a small recap feels appropriate. Under the leadership of George Routledge, Romania distanced itself from the Soviet Union, initially for economic reasons. Within the Eastern Bloc, Romania was supposed to serve as a mostly agricultural power. Romanian communists, however, preferred to develop their industrial capacity. They insisted that the Soviets couldn't order them to abandon their industrial plans. And in fact, they insisted that the Soviets couldn't order them to do anything at all. They opposed the seeming default of Soviet leadership in the global communist movement and maintained a strict neutrality in the Sino-Soviet split. This stance translated itself into state propaganda. The Romanian Communist Party, the RCP, was framed as a defender of national sovereignty. The official narrative praised the Dacian kings and medieval Romanian princes. According to the story, all of them had protected Romania from foreign rule, just like the Communist Party was doing. The new man in charge, Nicolae Ceaușescu, was basically a second Decebalus. Things culminated in 1968 with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the crushing of the Prague Spring. Ceaușescu gave a public speech and harshly denounced the invasion. The cheering crowd in Bucharest had reasons to believe that things in Romania were turning to the good for once. The problem is, the crowd was wrong. Solidarity with Czechoslovakia could inspire hopes of liberalization, expanded civil liberties, more openness to the West, and better living conditions. But to quote Amy Winehouse, no, no, no. Romania would go in the opposite direction. In July 1971, Ceausescu publicized his new political program, the July Theses. There, he called for an increase of political education and party control. He denounced bourgeois influences in society and culture. The contents were almost Stalinist in nature. In November of the same year, the RCP Central Committee elaborated on the program and made it a reality. Publishing houses changed their editorial plans, TV replaced Western movies with propaganda, and artists returned to socialist realism. The Romanian public was shocked enough to dub it the cultural mini-revolution. But why do this, we should ask? Is there any particular reason why Ceausescu suddenly decided to play Stalin? Well, we don't know for sure. What we do know, though, is that a month before the publication of the July Theses, Ceausescu had made a trip to Beijing and then to Pyongyang. We also know that he was impressed by what he saw. Quote, "Another aspect that deserves attention is the ideological activity. In my opinion, they took a revolutionary turn, and we can really speak of a cultural revolution. They put aside, maybe too suddenly, but in my view they did the right thing, all these petty bourgeois mentalities and started again from the very beginning. All of their cultural activity, ballet, theater, was set on revolutionary basis. They said so, we do not want any bourgeois concept to get here." Could it be the case that Ceausescu simply looked at North Korea and decided that, yeah, this is exactly what the perfect society looks like? I mean, yes, it could be that simple, but it's almost certainly more complicated than that. Looking abroad for a moment, other socialist regimes in Eastern Europe did not appear particularly stable. Look at Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland, well, multiple times. Ceausescu believed that the reason behind this instability was a breach in the relationship between the party and the people. His solution was to keep in touch with the working class, but not through compromise or dialogue, of course. Ceausescu aimed for persuasion and mobilization. Society was to meet the expectations of the party, or else. Now, in addition, the goal of distancing Romania from the Soviet Union was still relevant. Ceausescu knew that moving closer to the West was potentially dangerous, as Czechoslovakia had discovered the hard way. However, if Romania emulated China, a socialist nation, the Soviets might find it acceptable. So Ceausescu was in a situation similar to that of Mao. He experienced foreign pressure, thought that the party control was insufficient, and was predisposed to self-reliance. It's no wonder that the response was similar. At the center of this new Romanian ideology was Ceausescu himself, centered in a cult of personality. Initially, he was genuinely popular, and it did help him secure his position in the party itself. The cult of Ceausescu rose slowly but steadily. It came fully into its own in 1974, when Ceausescu was elected Romania's first president. From then on, he was variably known as the Architect, Celestial Body, Demiurge, Secular God, Fir Tree, Prince Charming, Genius, Saint, Miracle, Morning Star, Navigator, Savior, Sun, Titan, Visionary, Genius of the Carpathians, Full-Flowing Danube of Reason, Hero of Heroes, Worker of Workers, First Personage of the World, or more commonly, Conducător, meaning leader. His wife Elena became the second person in the country and was dubbed Mother of the Nation. Elena was even awarded a PhD in chemistry, despite not having any formal higher education. The new totalitarian policies were most visible in Bucharest, more precisely in its urban planning. The impact was so massive that Romanians called it Ceaușima, a wordplay on Hiroshima. Large areas of central Bucharest were razed to the ground and its occupants evicted. In their place, the government built monumental structures, roads, and boulevards. The implicit goal was to destroy the visual past of the capital and replace it with a new, symmetrical, artificial landscape. In the words of a classic, smooth-brained dictator plus construction equals dumb. Now, Romania was equally and notoriously known for its natalist program. The declared aim was to increase the size of the workforce, regulate sexual behavior, and create a new socialist man and woman. Yes, it does sound a lot like Stalinism in the idea of Homo Sovieticus. Romania was possibly communist on paper, but these policies look like something from a conservative populist's wet dream. Abortion was banned, condoms and birth control were made unavailable, divorce was made difficult to get, families without children paid extra taxes, gays, lesbians, and other non-cis hetero people hid their orientation or endured prison terms. And then in the late 1970s, things turned from bad to worse. The economy collapsed. As we've mentioned before, Romania had pursued strong industrial development. It wasn't an inherently bad policy, and in fact, Romania was quite successful at it. Millions of former peasants obtained indoor plumbing, central heating, and had access to modern mass transit. The economy grew and became more complex. In 1979, however, the global economy was hit by an oil shock. Interest rates skyrocketed, and the cheap money that was being used to fund industrialization was no longer available. In addition, Romanian industry demanded a lot of energy, and her own oil reserves were insufficient. Ceausescu faced deficit. Rather than maybe slow things down and weather the storm, however, Romania pushed on with its industrial development, acting as if there was no crisis. As a result, in just 5 years, her foreign debt had skyrocketed from $500 million to $10.4 billion. 80% of Romania's hard currency exports were used just to finance that foreign debt. By 1982, the issue could no longer be ignored. Ceausescu radically revised the 5-year plan and made repaying the debt the main priority. And it wasn't to be done at the cost of building new factories or port facilities, because, of course not. Instead, the Romanian people were just going to have to tighten their belts and bear the burden in this new era of austerity. Living standards plummeted. Schools in urban blocks endured regular blackouts. Heating in sub-zero temperatures was not guaranteed. Medicine was in short supply, including essential items like insulin, cotton pads, and single-use syringes. Long queues for everyday items became normal. Food rations were introduced, imports were cut, and goods replaced with local substitutes, usually of much poorer quality. University students and professors spent weeks every year harvesting crops. Now, through these means, Ceausescu and the Romanian people did achieve the intended goal. In 1989, Romania had fully repaid its foreign debt. But the austerity measures continued. In fact, Ceausescu now wanted Romania to be a creditor and to invest money into the developing world. Any concern for domestic living standards was just not a priority. And there wasn't much an average Romanian citizen could do to oppose Ceausescu's policies. Romania's secret police, the Securitate, prevented collective protests. The most common expression of dissent was a go-slow work attitude, impacting efficiency rather than outcome. In the words of a contemporary, we will complete the 5-year plan in 4 years and a half at any cost, even if it takes us a decade. Now, some prominent public protests did take place. The first one occurred in 1977 in the Jiu Valley, an area mostly known for coal mining. In the summer of that year, the Romanian parliament voted for a law concerning state pensions. As far as the miners were concerned, this law raised the retirement age, extended their workday from 6 to 8 hours, and cancelled various sickness and disability benefits. Between 30,000 and 40,000 miners went on strike. It was a non-violent sit-down protest, meaning the workers seized control of their workplace, the means of production if you will, and simply refused to work. The miners prepared a list of demands and asked to negotiate only with Ceausescu personally. 3 days later, Ceausescu conceded to the workers' demands and the strike was over. However, gradually, state repression followed. The next winter, about 4,000 miners were forced to move to other areas of the country. Strike leaders found themselves under surveillance and even supervision. Most of the concessions granted by Ceausescu were ultimately short-lived. The next prominent protest event took place on November 15, 1987, long into the austerity era. In the city of Brașov, truck plant workers protested against wage cuts. About 300 protesters even left the factory and marched to the city center. They were joined by thousands of citizens of Brașov unhappy with the austerity measures. Shouting "Down with Ceausescu," the crowd entered the local party headquarters, threw around furniture, and set it on fire. Around midnight, the riot police intervened and forcibly dispersed the crowd. Many workers were arrested and 61 of them received prison terms ranging from 6 months to 3 years. However, Romania could not escape history, not even the end of history. We'll come back to Fukuyama at some later date, but in the meantime, by 1989, socialist regimes were falling all over Central and Eastern Europe. Ceausescu himself only outlived the Berlin Wall by a month and a half. In August 1989, a reformist Hungarian pastor named Tőkés László gave an interview to Canadian television. There, he criticized Bucharest's policies of raising villages in Transylvania, which were largely populated by Hungarian or German-speaking people. As a result of this interview, he was set to be evicted from his house in Timișoara on December 15th of that year. Tőkés called for his parishioners to protest against his eviction in front of his house. While the city mayor did revoke the eviction order, a crowd of supporters gathered anyway. The number of people grew, and soon the protest escalated. People shouted slogans against Ceausescu and attacked the party headquarters. On December 17th, Ceausescu proclaimed a state of emergency in Timișoara, and he ordered General Gusa to restore order in the city. He made it clear that the demonstrators were to be shot, and if his subordinates refused, they would be shot too. Violent clashes broke out in Timișoara. Over the course of 5 days, 72 people died and a further 253 people were wounded. And against the overall run of play, it was a fight which the protesters won. The workers joined the revolution en masse and demanded that the military get off the streets. On December 20th, General Gusa conceded and ordered his troops to return to barracks. Timișoara became a free city. The violence of these events resulted in the Romanian authorities being condemned by multiple Western countries, the Soviet Union, and even most of the Warsaw Pact, which you will remember at this point was still a thing, but its member nations were no longer socialist. Ceausescu, who was by now in a pretty bad situation, blamed the protests on a familiar litany of people: terrorists, reactionaries, imperialists, Kaiser Soze, chauvinists, and foreign secret services. You know, the usual suspects. On December 21st, Ceausescu held a meeting in Bucharest trying to position himself once again as a protector of Romanian sovereignty. This effort, to put it mildly however, did not go according to plan. His speech was interrupted by loud shouts, clamoring and yelling. Ceausescu panicked, the meeting was cancelled, and the crowd was dispersed. And during the course of that night, fighting broke out in Bucharest. The protesters, the army, the Securitate forces, the police, and pro-communist paramilitaries all clashed together. The death toll rose to 159. The next morning, Ceausescu declared a national state of emergency. The Minister of Defense was found dead, and his deputy was ordered to use force. However, Ceausescu was no longer in control. The Ministry of Defense, Ministry of the Interior, the Securitate, they all ordered their troops to return to their barracks and to stop firing on demonstrators. The Ceausescu family tried to flee in a helicopter, but they were detained soon after in Târgoviște. Romanian television proclaimed the victory of the revolution. In the absence of Ceausescu, power was assumed by the Front of National Salvation, which had only been founded that same day. The Front appointed a council of 39 members. They included people from the older opposition groups, the Communist Party, the military, the Securitate, young technocrats, intellectuals, writers, and members of the Hungarian minority. The face of the new regime, Ion Iliescu, was in many ways quite the moderate. He spoke to the crowd about the noble ideas of communism, called the protesters comrades, and assured Moscow that Romania was not going to leave its sphere of influence. But the fighting didn't stop. In fact, it became worse. Over the next 3 days, 957 people died and 2,587 people were injured. To this day, it's unclear as to who exactly was responsible. Maybe there were still forces loyal to Ceausescu. Maybe the new regime needed a picture of a looming civil war to justify drastic measures. Maybe the Soviet Union needed a reason to intervene. In any case, the violence was solved by eliminating the former dictator physically. On December 25th, after a short tribunal, Nicolae and Elena Ceauşescu were executed. The next day, the footage of the execution was shown on TV to both a Romanian and a global audience. The revolution was over. And thus ended socialist rule in Romania. Ceausescu, even today, is not particularly loved by Romanians, but the revolution is a bittersweet memory. The common notion is that thousands of people died or were injured in vain, and that the revolution was stolen. The new regime entrenched itself in power, and most people responsible for the bloodshed escaped justice. Multiple documents were confiscated, destroyed, forged, or still have not been made public. It was as if a group of dissidents within the RCP simply took over. Romania's further transformation and European integration, however, are topics for another day. We do cover stories from the post-Cold War if there's sufficient interest, and to make sure you don't miss any of them, please make sure to press the subscribe and bell buttons. If you can, send the subscribe button a sweater and some slippers. Due to austerity measures to pay off loans to the bell button, they just had their heat turned off. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.